If it's Thursday, we have enough crises already, but now we're creating one. The U.S. government hits the debt limit, sort of, as Washington braces for months of totally unnecessary threats and manufactured brinksmanship, with the fate of the global economy on the line if the U.S. actually defaults. Plus, President Biden right now is in storm-ravaged California to see firsthand the billion-dollar damage and massive recovery effort, and meet face-to-face with first responders and local officials. And unsolved mystery. The Supreme Court claims its investigation into who leaked the bombshell opinion overturning Roe v. Wade has come up empty. How hard are they looking? Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Chuck Todd here in Washington, where we're about 4.5 months away from a potentially and totally avoidable economic calamity thanks to senseless brinkmanship. The Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen announced this morning that the U.S. government technically hit its statutory debt limit, forcing Treasury to invoke what they refer to as extraordinary measures. But frankly, they've become ordinary tools over the last 10 years to meet its many, many financial obligations. In a letter to the House Speaker, Kevin McCarthy, Yellen warned that these measures will keep the government solvent through June 5th, at which point it would default. And as we saw in 2011 and 2013, even the threat of a default is enough to wreak havoc on markets, mess up interest rates. Really, the only people that win are hedge funds who are just laughing at this government playing games so they can play games with the market. Actually, defaulting, of course, would be so much worse. Here's former Obama Treasury Secretary Jack Lew, who saw both of those debt limit showdowns up close and personal as Treasury Secretary.
If we actually were to cross the line and get to the point where we didn't pay our bondholders or we didn't pay citizens who are waiting to get benefits from the federal government, schools that are serving lunches to students that don't have the funding, the electric company that puts on the lights in federal buildings, you get into a place that affects every aspect of American life.
Look, it's obvious, right? We do not have to be in this position. It's a simple act of Congress to raise the debt limit, as it did in December of 2021, as it has done 78 times since 1960. But any act in this Congress with this House is not so simple, especially when you have a bunch of members who actually take pride in doing nothing, and in this case, doing nothing would actually create the calamity. Members of the House Freedom Caucus are digging in. They're demanding spending cuts, and they don't mind everything shutting down to get their cuts. That's a feature, not a bug to them. And Democrats, of course, are insisting you can't negotiate over this. There is actually an entire budget process that takes place this year where you can negotiate spending. The debt ceiling is not one of those. But here's Arizona Republican Andy Biggs tweeting this week, "We cannot raise the debt ceiling. Democrats have carelessly spent our taxpayer money and devalued our currency. They've made their bed, so they must lie in it." Obviously, it's incredible hypocrisy, because if you look at the 4 years of the Trump presidency, there was never any of these debt ceiling standoffs. The national debt increased by nearly $8 trillion, especially when there was all Republican control for 2 of those 4 years. That represents about 25% of all U.S. debt. So Republicans in Congress raised the debt ceiling 3 times during the Trump administration. At no point did they demand spending cuts to do that, or did they threaten to take the economy hostage like this. But now, of course, some in the ultra-conservative wing of the Republican caucus are willing to crash this global economy, and then they'll go ahead and blame President Biden. And perhaps many of their constituents in their partisan cocoons will go ahead and believe it. And ask yourself, what political consequences would those Republicans face if that happened? Remember, they represent deep red districts whose constituents sent them to Congress even after they tried to overturn the election, even after they were censured, and even after they sowed chaos in Washington. Again, the voters rewarded them for this behavior. This is what we're looking at. These lawmakers were also pivotal in getting Kevin McCarthy the speakership. So he's unlikely to punish them this time. He has punished them in the past. Folks, this is what makes this looming debt ceiling fight different, a bit scarier, perhaps a bit more real, and also sillier than at any other time. Look, can Congress find a way to raise the debt limit without any of these ultra-conservative lawmakers? Yes, it could. And it may take a discharge position. Good luck having to deal with that. But the White House, they want to play hardball and argue it has the constitutional authority to avoid default, even if Republicans vote against it. Yeah, they could, but they're not doing that yet. They actually don't mind having a debate about this manufactured crisis because they think the politics are good for them. We are witnessing a crisis being manufactured totally created before our eyes, unnecessarily. And everybody just sees short-term political benefit for them to engage in this practice. For lawmakers in Congress who get to score political points by attacking the other side for being recalcitrant. And for officials at the White House who are eager to talk about anything other than classified documents right now. Bottom line, in any normal Washington, 4 months of talk about the debt ceiling would be seen as a farce. Well, normal Washington is a farce these days. Joining me now is from Capitol Hill, Ryan Nobles, our Capitol Hill correspondent. And in a moment, I'll be joined on set by our senior White House correspondent, Kelly O'Donnell. So, Ryan, what is the current state of debt limit negotiations? Is there one? Are Republicans going to present a plan first? Are they wanting Biden to present a plan? I mean, it feels like we are in the very early stages of the very early stages.
I think that's a good way to describe it, Chuck. And I would describe where we are right now in the staring contest phase. Kevin McCarthy wants a meeting. Joe Biden says he doesn't want to negotiate. As a result, they're both two immovable forces on either side of Pennsylvania Avenue waiting for the other to blink. And I think it's very clear, despite all the caveats that you rightly applied in your intro about the debt limit having nothing to do with future spending or budget negotiations, in reality, that's not necessarily how Congress works. Well, I was talking with a colleague about this today and said, how can Republicans make the debt ceiling about future spending? And I asked, have you met Congress before? They constantly use whatever leverage points they have in order to get what they want. And the simple fact of the matter is that House Republicans in particular have so few tools to play with when it comes to negotiating strength here in Washington. They do not have control of the Senate. They obviously do not have control of the White House. The one tool they have is the debt ceiling. And so that forces the Biden administration and Senate Democrats to at least begin a conversation about finding a way to get the debt ceiling over the finish line. What both sides are doing right now, is, as you rightly point out, Chuck, is using the full faith and credit of the United States as essentially this volleyball that they're bouncing back and forth with a real possibility of serious economic calamity. But that's where we are right now. Obviously, this is not something that's going to become a super important problem until the summer. And another thing that always happens in Congress, Chuck, is if they have time to make a decision, they will use that time.
Sure. I guess what I don't get about this is, Ryan, is if they hadn't done this before, I understand, well, let's try this tactic and see if it works, either substantively or politically. The fact is, not only does this tactic never work, it has always backsplashed on the right when they've tried it. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again. I don't quite get this.
Yeah, and I do think you're right about that from a general election perspective. There's no doubt that Republicans have been punished by middle-of-the-road voters when it comes to using the brinkmanship of the debt ceiling to try and bring about change. But there is still the reality that within the far right of the party, basically a big swath of the Republicans that were elected, particularly in the House, won elections in Republican primaries to get here. Their general elections were a foregone conclusion. And there are still many conservative Republicans that are spurred on by conservative media who still view the debt ceiling as kind of a panacea to solve all government spending problems. And so they're going to continue to beat that drum. And again, I go back to this original point I made. They don't have any other options. Right. This is really the only thing they have to try and hold over the head of both the White House and the Democrats in the Senate. So since they have this tool in their tool chest, they're going to use it until they can't anymore.
Yeah, the regular budget process is a tool too. But anyway, we can teach them how Congress works down the road. Ryan Nobles on Capitol Hill for us. Thank you, Kelly O'Donnell, who's done her tours of duty on Capitol Hill.
Yes, this is all very familiar.
I was just going to say, but I want to talk to you from the White House perspective, because I think the White House is enjoying having this fight. Rather than trying to be the grown-up in the room, they almost are poking the bear, because it looks, look, the first letter Janet Yellen put out was like within 12 hours of the classified document problem. I mean, people will criticize me for both sidesing it. But I'm sorry, it looks like they're embracing the fight rather than being the grown-up in the room here.
Well, one option for the president would be to directly engage with the new speaker on this issue. That is not happening at this point. Right. And if there's a tool for the president, it's time. And he's going to use that time, it would appear, and that turns the screws and puts more of the pressure back on lawmakers. And what we've heard from the White House is that this is their constitutional responsibility. Let them feel it. So turn up the heat, let it sizzle a bit. When that heat comes, we're not sure, because as you've just laid out very clearly, they relish this conversation and use it in ways that don't match up with the facts. But for the Biden White House, today we've seen kind of a lifeline from Janet Yellen laying out how they can have some additional time. And they want to turn the sort of mirror of irresponsibility, as they would characterize it, onto the House.
I get the political argument. But the grown-up thing to do here, because right now I feel like the only people that benefit are hedge funds who get to game this situation. I mean, it's sad, but that is how they're the ones that benefit from these artificial market gyrations. Like, I don't understand why the president just said, look, we're not going to default. I don't know how they're going to do it. I assume they'll figure out how to resolve it. Maybe 5 Republicans, however they do it. By the way, I've got the 14-minute. We're not going to default, end of story. But I'm not having a public debate about this. That is not the posture they want to have.
Well, and when you think of just what we've gone through with inflationary prices, gas prices, where even just a little uptick in the cost to the average American, and how the White House tried to rally around that and do a lot of messaging and bring whatever tools they had to bear. Imagine the cost to people's retirement accounts, the uncertainty in all the ways the financial markets affect people's realized housing values and how that impacts throughout the economy, job security.
Well, that's why that's why creating that clarity. That's what I don't get here. Instead, they're engaging in this back and forth, which then only creates more. They want us having 5 months of stories saying, oh, this could happen. It's like, you and I both know this is not going to happen. We just don't know how it ends.
Well, we sure hope it doesn't happen, because we don't want to see that outcome.
Right, but there are plenty of ways to avoid this outcome when the responsible people
And usually
act.
the 11th hour that we have both lived through includes something like whether it's a Mitch McConnell in his role at a given time or a Chuck Schumer who steps forward and says we will not default. And we could hasten that moment by having the president, Mitch McConnell, Speaker McCarthy, come to that point more quickly. Maybe they will, but they are using the time available right now.
There's just too much politics to be enacted. All right. Nice to see you.
Good to see you, yes.
All right. Kelly O'Donnell, thank you. And joining me now is David Plouffe. He's a former senior advisor to President Obama, an NBC News political analyst, but most importantly, he was by the president's side back in 2011 during the debt ceiling negotiations. And let me start with that word, negotiation. Why is it a negotiation? Should President Biden right now, David, say, look, we're not going to break through the debt ceiling. I assume 5 Republicans are going to join Democrats to lift the debt ceiling when it's necessary. And if they don't do it, we're not going to default because I'm going to mint the coin or I'm going to do this. And we're not negotiating. End of story. But that isn't the position. But should it be?
Well, the coin thing's not real, having gone through this, right? But the rest of it, I think, is right. I think you have to set, a clear line that you're not going to negotiate. And of course, Chuck, what's important is you can say, my Republican friends lifted the debt ceiling with no concern when Donald Trump was president, and yet we had even higher deficits then. So this isn't on the level. This is all, politics, the hard rate trying to basically extort Kevin McCarthy. So I think they should be very clear. I think the other thing, State of the Union's a good opportunity for this. You always have to remind people what this is and what it isn't. It's not new spending, it's old spending. You got to remind people what will happen. A lot of people conflate defaulting on our debt with a government shutdown. They are very different things. So in terms of higher interest rates, ultimately not paying Social Security payments, VA healthcare benefits, the destruction of the economy. And it's worth reminding everybody the economy right now is incredibly fragile. So I don't know at the end of the day how this gets resolved. And these things you always have to look for. Is there an off-ramp? The only off-ramp I can see is, a discharge petition.
That's
or
the only one
perhaps
I see.
Republicans.
Yeah.
It's the only one I see. Because Biden might say, and Democrats in the Senate might say no negotiation. And Republicans are going to say there's going to be a negotiation. Right. So, and Kevin McCarthy can't somehow, on his own watch, say, fine, we're going to pass this with mostly Democrats. I'll throw you 20 votes. He'll lose. He'll get, thrown out as speaker. So that's what's so scary about this time. As scary as it was last time, and I do have PTSD around it because we got very close to defaulting. You might remember the market went down 20%. Right. It was massive consequences.
And considering that the resolution was a failure, right? The super committee never really happened, right? They tried, but it didn't work. Do you regret negotiating back then? I mean, look, in hindsight, and I'm not going to relitigating so many of those moments, but the fact that there was a negotiation then, I think somehow gives the far right hopes that a negotiation will happen again.
Yeah, well, and it was a little more complex than that because it wasn't just a debt ceiling. There was, Obama talked about, we need to raise revenues, but we also need to, in some places increase spending, cut spending. The Simpson-Bowles Commission was out then. So there was a lot that got wrapped into this. I think this stands a little bit more alone. But sure, in retrospect, even though the final deal, had some things that were probably good policy, it was a pretty ugly time. And so the question I ask is, if we had negotiated, would we have crashed through the debt ceiling? I think Boehner probably would have prevented that, who's obviously a much more responsible figure than McCarthy, but he'd be the first one to tell you he wasn't fully in control of his caucus. Right. So we might have crashed through it then. And again, we were coming out of the financial crisis. Like the economy could not afford any more shocks. That's very important to remember, both then and now. This economy cannot afford any more weight on it. But I think the White House should say they're not going to negotiate. The other option, I guess, here, Chuck, would be some sort of commission. I think that's an unlikely off-ramp. So the only off-ramp I can see that looks realistic is the discharge petition. So your viewers need to get smart on what that thing is.
No, I get that. But I'm curious. Let me ask you how you would handle the folks over at the Main Street Main Street Partnership. They're sort of the representative of the governing wing of House Republicans. Yeah. Think Don Bacon in Omaha, Nancy Mace in Charleston, South Carolina. And they said that they basically are saying that Biden needs to negotiate. They're not as hard right, but now I understand for their own politics, even if they're going to be willing to do a clean raise, they can't say that now. Should the White House engage with them? Because the minute you engage with them, then you're negotiating. Or do you draw the hard line with them, too, the handful of Republicans you can deal with?
Well, Chuck, I'm always cognizant that, I'm sort of sitting in the cheap seats now, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm not like in the bunker. But yeah, I think you do. My advice would be to draw a hard line, because I think at the end of the day, that's the thing. What's fascinating about this, Chuck, when we looked at McCarthy's race for speaker, now the debt ceiling, everybody's focused on Marjorie Taylor Greene and Boebert and, Biggs, when the people who should have the most power in that caucus are the people who just won marginal seats, who have to win re-election, or the Democrats take power. So eventually, I think those members are going to be the ones that at the last hour, when it gets way too late, insist on a clean increase. Now, there's some other things that can be done. You've obviously got, appropriations bills later in the year. There's commissions that could be set up. By the way,
that is a legit, isn't that the legitimate, this is why I tell my Republican guests, there's a whole budget process. Have a spending cut. Exactly. You want to devise a series of spending cuts. That's where you do it. You can't do it on your credit card statement.
That's exactly right. The Congress has already decided we're going to spend this money. So the time to have this fight is later in the year, when you decide how much we're going to spend in the next fiscal year. That's exactly right.
But I guess the thing, I want to get back to something. This feels like a pointless exercise where all we're going to do is allow hedge funds to make money on the stupidity of the gyrations of the market, because it's so easy to figure out what the clown show is going to end up doing at the end of the day. But I guess I do get the sense that the White House doesn't mind this political fight at a time when they don't want to talk about other things like classified documents.
Well, here's what I'd say. I would say, so first of all, from a governing standpoint, you're the president. You don't want to see the economy get any weaker. Yeah. And from a political standpoint, as you're heading to re-election, you certainly don't want to see the economy get weaker. So I'd be careful about that. I think there's no question. The last election told us, we had high inflation, people dissatisfied with the economy, but Republicans had a really disappointing election because voters are more sophisticated than often they're given credit for. They didn't like the anti-democracy stuff. They didn't like the extremism in the Republican Party. So yes, I do think it'll be easy to paint this problem as this is the Republicans. This is a faction of the Republican Party who basically wants to destroy our economy. So yes, I think that you should be able to win the political messaging, but the bloodletting all around you is going to be pretty devastating. And again, a lot of economists are predicting we're going to be in recession end of this year, heading into next year, which is the president's re-election year. You add a debt ceiling crisis on top of that, you may almost guarantee that.
And I think what we ought to remember is, while President Obama politically got the best of House Republicans by November of 2012, everybody was hurting in the fall of 2011. Yeah, no, that was the low moment, arguably, of the entire 8 years. David Plouffe, as always, sir, good to get your perspective 10 years later.
Good to be with you, Chuck.
Coming up, politics and probes. Supreme Court just wrapped up its investigation, I used air quotes there, into who was behind last year's draft opinion leak that the court says was one of the worst breaches of trust in its history. So what did they find? Panel is next. Plus, a major weapons deal should be announced sometime tomorrow as Kyiv looks to the west for heavy tanks, more weapons. You know the list. We'll have the latest from the Pentagon ahead. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. Apparently, we may never know who leaked a draft of the Supreme Court opinion that indicated the court would overturn Roe v. Wade. More than a month before that decision was actually issued. Supreme Court announced today that it has been unable to identify the person who leaked the draft to Politico last May. In a statement that accompanied the final report of its investigation, the court stated that the team of investigators has been, quote, unable to identify a person responsible by a preponderance of the evidence. Keep in mind, it appears investigators did not interview any of the justices. They only interviewed clerks and other staff. Anyway, panel joins me now, NBC News Washington correspondent Michelle Sindor, former North Dakota senator and current CNBC contributor Heidi Heitkamp, and Danielle Plekta, senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and an NBC News contributor. Yamiche, it's hard not to wonder if the Supreme Court didn't find or is deciding not to find.
It's a key question. I mean, while it's hard to think that a justice would leak this, it's not, I think, beyond measure to think that maybe that's where this came from. And the idea that they can't find who leaked this, in some ways,
can or won't, right? Like that's
can or won't. Right. It's a big question. I also think, I mean, the striking thing to me about this is, of course, this is news. Everyone was like, "Who broke this?" Politico had this huge scoop. But I also think that the story of abortion has moved on so much. It's now how we're seeing in conservative states how women's rights are being taken away and abortion access is going away. And then in blue states, how you have these underground railroad almost operations where you're funneling women from states that can't get abortions into those states. So in some ways, it's like, yes, this is a big deal that they couldn't find this person, but the story just seems to be so much, what's the situation now?
I don't want to presume anything here, Heidi, but one gets the sense, if you're Chief Justice Roberts, there may have been a point you said, look, there's all sorts of stories that the justices aren't getting along, that this has really messed up trust. It sounds like he was like, can we move on?
Yeah.
Like, and you can't help but wonder, because we brought in Michael Chertoff. Okay, did you? Is this good advertisement for Michael Chertoff? Like, it just tells me if you really wanted to find out, you could. They didn't. I don't know if they wanted to know.
Well, I think they also found out that their security on copies of this is pretty lax. Mm-hmm. And so when you hear how the investigation was done, that it was really disparate printers all through the building. They couldn't trace back more than 60 documents of who printed what out. And so, you know, I think the bottom line is, it goes back to the point you made, no harm, no foul. So we found out 3-4 months earlier than what we normally would have found out. The result was the same. And the political consequences, beyond the consequences for women's reproductive rights, the political consequences continue to reverberate. In fact, we saw a legislative race in Virginia that probably was decided on this issue. And so even President Trump said that reversal of Roe v. Wade was critical.
You know, Danny, my favorite part of the whodidit story is that I'll talk to my liberal friends and they swear it came from the right, and I talk to my conservative friends, and they can make a case. They swear it came from the left. Like, neither side wants to admit it came from their own side.
Well, I don't think anybody knows. Look, I asked a friend of mine who was a Supreme Court clerk what the gossip was, and he said everybody knows it was a clerk. I think your theory is exactly right, that Justice Roberts looks at this and says to himself, what am I going to get out of this discovery?
What's the gain, right?
I also want to make another point, though, which is that we've had so many leaks of highly classified information, of extremely sensitive things, human intelligence, and it is very, very rare that we find the leaker. So it's not crazy. I don't think we need to probably name call Chertoff. He probably didn't do an awful job.
But the idea that they put him, that they said they hired him, though. I mean, it's like poor.
They hired him to review the investigation that was already being done by the marshal.
It does seem that it does. You bring up the good point here, and in fact, I want to move to the March for Life. Right here, they are on Roe v. The anniversary. Normally, it's about Roe v. Wade. It's interesting to me. The march isn't going to end at the Supreme Court this time, right? I think the march is going to end at the Capitol.
Yeah, they're making this route diversion and changing it to really, I think, hammer home the point hammer home the point that the Congress is where the fight is now. I think House Republicans, for as much as you could say they really had all of these issues and challenges and losses, frankly, in the midterms, they still went out and when they got control of Congress, immediately started introducing legislation to restrict abortion rights across the country. So you have this Republican Party that, even though this is not an issue that is frankly working for them, based on my own reporting, Republican and Democratic women were pissed off, frankly, by this Dobbs decision. You have a Republican Party that is sticking to that, even when you say, Senator, that former President Donald Trump is saying, well, this is not a great issue for us. At the end of the day, it's his 3 justices that delivered this, and that Republicans at some point had to say, we're going to have to own this issue. Let's just embrace it. So it's very interesting to see that the march is stopping at the Capitol.
Danny, we're going to see a lot more phone calls back into March for Life. The way it always was interesting to me.
God, yes.
Right, all the pro-life, right. Nobody wanted to be seen with the March for Lifers, but they wanted to be, but they'll phone it in.
Well,
is that back again?
No, a lot of this debate has always been performative, and that's not going to change. I mean, Washington is a performative town, and it's become only worse.
It's a bad performance. I mean, vaudeville would be jealous.
I don't want to diminish the sincerity of belief on either side of this debate, and I do find it a little ironic that we're citing Donald Trump as a great authority on what to do politically right now. Suddenly, he's become a wise advisor of what to do.
Yeah, careful of the blind squirrel effect.
I'm going to bring Donald Trump into every conversation because when Donald Trump has center stage, that's a good day for Democrats.
The debt ceiling fight, it feels like nobody's going to come out in a good place. Republicans will probably end up with more backsplash on them than Democrats here, but are we going through 6 months of a nightmare that only benefits hedge fund owners?
Yeah, I mean, and most people don't understand it. They think it's about cutting spending. And, we went through this in 2013, you might remember, and we shut down government. But when we pushed up against the debt limit in the banking committee, we had a hearing at my urgence to talk to professionals. What does this mean for the stock market? What does it mean for the mortgage brokers? And there was something that was said in there. It said, when a bell is rung, you can't unring it. Right now, treasuries are on every balance sheet at 100% of value. Well, that reflects the full faith and credit of the United States government. You threaten that, in fact, breach the debt limit, you're going to have to account for that. It's going to take billions of dollars of value off balance sheets. And so this is not small.
Danny, you were a congressional staffer back in the day. I get that must-pass legislation is always, hey, let's go. This is where we get it. I get it. Isn't there a better place to have a spending fight, since they just had this huge rules fight in the House over how to do the budget process? Have the spending fight where it belongs.
Look, I want to take a contrarian view of this. I understand, you ask a stockbroker, you ask a businessman what he thinks. Of course he's going to say these things. Why don't we ask them what they think about the fact that the United States is $31 trillion, and I'm understating by a couple percentage points here, in debt. More under each president, Republicans, Democrats. Barack Obama, when he was a senator, called this a failure of leadership. Okay, is there a moment when we can have a serious discussion about spending? Is there a moment when we can recognize that we don't have leadership on this issue? Not Republicans, not Democrats.
That's not here. It's not at the debt limit. And I would challenge every Republican. Fine, have that conversation. What prevents you from putting a bill on the floor of the House that gives you a debt limit and cuts spending? Nothing. Nothing prevents them from doing that today. Yeah, go ahead and show us what you're going to do. They don't want the responsibility for cutting spending that's enormously popular in this country, especially Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security.
And entitlements, and we can't afford it. We elect people to make these decisions, and they should make them when they can, not at a moment that is convenient for a particular senator.
Tomorrow, speaking of senators, tomorrow, our own Ryan Nobles, Yamiche, is indicating we're going to hear from Tim Kaine. He's going to announce whether or not he's running. When you get one of those whether or nots, and you're wondering, and it's somebody who was, I think he was first elected in 2012. It was your cycle, I believe, Heidi, right? In 2012, he's had a long bout with long COVID. He hasn't been doing a lot of fundraising, as Heidi pointed out. this would be the second Democratic retirement if that's the case.
It would be, and in some ways it's interesting because Tim Kaine, when you think about who he is, someone who is not particularly combative, someone who almost, but for a couple thousand votes, could have been the vice president. He feels almost like old Washington, and I know that's maybe weird for me to say, but I think that he feels a little bit like old Washington.
Thanks.
Because
I feel even older on this side of the table there, Yavish.
I only say that because he's someone who can kind of get along with the other side and openly say, let's try to find a common ground. And then you see some of the other senators and some of the other lawmakers who are sort of the stars of the party, and they're the people who are bashing the other side across the head. So if Tim Kaine leaves, of course the Democrats are going to lose someone who's critical, but also I think it's someone who just feels like a time when we all got along a little bit better.
Danny, you're a Virginia resident. Very quickly, do you believe Virginia's competitive in an open process or not in a Senate race in a presidential year?
I think it'll be hard, but I think it all depends on who's standing on the stage.
Right.
Here's a rumor. Liz Cheney runs as an independent in Virginia.
That's a good one.
That was a good one. That's a drop the mic. Somebody has learned to become a pundit. Good job, ex-senator. Nice work, Heidi. Yavish, Heidi, and Danny. Wow. Thank you. Liz Cheney for Senate, independent. The Liz Cheney for Senate rumors in Virginia were actually about 10 years ago, the first time. But interesting. Up next, the White House expands California's major disaster declaration as President Biden is on the ground to see the extensive devastation firsthand. We're going to go live to Santa Cruz County, where damage estimates in just that one county are already in the tens of millions. That's next. Welcome back. President Biden is on the ground in California as the state begins its recovery from what have been a devastating series of storms that have brought dangerous flooding and mudslides earlier this month. It's these atmospheric rivers that have come in 9 different versions of them that hit the state. The president was greeted by California Governor Gavin Newsom and one of California's 2 U.S. Senators, Alex Padilla. Last hour, Biden surveyed the damage via helicopter, and later this afternoon will meet with first responders and local business owners in hard-hit Santa Cruz County. 22 people died during these storms, which were caused by this phenomenon I was talking to you about earlier that's known as atmospheric rivers. The damages could cost the state upwards of $1 billion. We think it's the first of what sadly will be multiple billion-dollar natural disaster recovery efforts. On the ground is my colleague, and he's in Santa Cruz County right now, Gotti Schwartz. And Gotti, what's the president going to see, and what do local officials want him to take away from this visit?
Well, actually, Chuck, he's pulling up right now. This is Capitola. That's where we're at right now, and he's going to be in the area behind me. It's hard to make out, but let me just show you kind of this pier that you see right there. This is a perfect example of some of the damage to infrastructure. You see there's a chunk that's missing of that pier. It's cut off the businesses at the end of that pier, a beloved bait and tackle shop and a restaurant that's down there. This is just some of the damage in this community. Santa Cruz got about $55 million worth of damage that they've surveyed so far. So he's going to be meeting with some of the restaurant owners, some of the business owners right here along the boardwalk. One of those restaurants, it's right behind me. Parts of that pier and other massive pieces of debris and some of this driftwood that you see behind me made its way inside of that restaurant as those waves started crashing in. So what he's going to be hearing from residents, what he's going to be hearing from officials is the massive cleanup that's been underway here for quite some time. And then they're going to talk about how these storms came again and again and again. This isn't just one storm or two storms. Right. This is basically a month-long storm. And so they want to see a lot of this coastline and other parts of California that have been affected hardened so that this doesn't happen again. It's something that they've been dealing with now with wildfires, with climate change, with the storms that we're starting to see, the atmospheric rivers. And so that infrastructure, hardening that infrastructure is going to be very important in this conversation.
Well, Gotti Schwartz, it sounds like you've got even more reporting to do. As you said, the president is just arriving. We will look forward to more of your reporting throughout News Now and on Nightly Tonight. Gotti, thank you. And yes, please keep your camera on so we can check that out as well. Joining me now is Gary Griggs. He's a professor of Earth and Planetary Sciences at the University of California, Santa Cruz. So you've been experiencing this up close and personal. Let me ask you this. Let's start with what are going to be the after effects of this barrage of storms? We think we're not going to get any more of these atmospheric rivers. But are we going to see mudslides for the next few weeks? Are we going to see threats of flooding? I mean, what are the after effects here that Californians should be prepared for?
Yeah, I think the floods were the immediate thing, as well as the coastal storm damage from the waves and the onshore winds and the high tides. That seems to be calming down, but usually mudslides, particularly landslides, happen later when the ground has gotten fully saturated. So I think those may continue. But I think in terms of rainfall, the worst of the flooding is probably past.
So let's talk about the rainfall a minute. I think it feels like a cruel joke, right? We've been through this horrendous drought for so long, and then all of a sudden it's like, yeah, all right, you want to make up for all that water you didn't get? Here's a whole bunch of water, and you won't be able to use it all. How restorative have these storms been? And, if it's forecastable, is there a way to get better at capturing water?
No, really good questions. And if somebody would ask me 3 weeks ago, can we go from drought to flooding in a week? I would have said, I don't think so. But in fact, that's exactly what happened. We've had maybe the longest 20-year drought in our temperature history, going back well over a century. And all of a sudden, it floods within a week's time. So predictability is difficult. I think one of the things that's important to keep in mind is everybody wants protection now from these events, whether it's levees or dams or seawalls, and all protection stops somewhere. Mm-hmm. Can't afford to, nor do we build dams or levees to hold the 500 or 1,000-year event. It's just too expensive. And Katrina showed that, the flooding in Hurricane Sandy in New York. The other thing that's important to keep in mind is as the climate's changing, these events are changing. So what we might have called the 100-year storm 20 years ago is now going to occur maybe twice or 3 times as often, because everything suggests we're going to get hotter, drier summers and wetter winters with more intense rainfall and more debris flows and landslides.
What's a long-term resiliency fix that you hope the state pursues, but you fear they won't? Maybe it's cost, maybe it's politics, whatever. But it's sort of like, okay, if this is the time to do X, I certainly hope we do it. What is that X for you?
Well, I think for the longest time, we've relied on protection, and we're in a different world now. We've entered a different time period, and I won't call it the new normal because it's not level. It's going to keep going up. So there is really only one long-term solution. There's nothing we can do, for example, over the long term to hold back the Pacific Ocean. Mm-hmm. We're going to get floods that are probably going to be bigger and last longer. So when do we quit putting on Band-Aids and say we've got to think longer term? Is it 10 years? Is it 20 years? Is it 50 years? And along the coast, there's going to be places we're going to have to move back from.
Right.
Corps of Engineers for decades is now they're proposing walls around Charleston and New Orleans and Miami and New York. I mean, billions and billions of dollars, but that's going to buy us a few more years. But I think we have to start looking longer term and realizing that the climate's changing.
We've been seeing live pictures here of President Biden touring some parts of Capitola right now, Professor. It's funny you bring up the seawalls, because you're right. That is what Miami's pursuing. It is what it sounds like you believe. It's what Manhattan is likely going to pursue. It sounds like you think that's just going to delay the inevitable. It doesn't fix the problem.
Exactly. And what we don't know for sure, we know sea level is rising. We know it's rising at an accelerated rate. But what's difficult to know is exactly where it'll be in 2050 or 2100. And we can probably say with some assurance by 2100, by 2050, it'll maybe be a foot higher or so. By 2100, 2 feet, 3 feet, 5 feet, 8 feet, and that makes it really difficult to plan for. What also makes it difficult to plan for is this been called the whipsaw effect. We went from drought to flooding in a week. I think that is confusing for politicians and planners to know, well, what are we planning for? We've got to store more water, build more dams, or we've got too much water and we got to deal with it.
Well, Professor Gary Griggs, you have presented a lot of problems, a lot of options, and as we all know, the solutions are not easy. What politicians have to do is stop dithering and make some decisions. Anyway, Professor Griggs, really good to get your expertise on the air. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
After the break, U.S. officials are rejecting Ukraine's request for now for long-range missiles as yet another massive aid package is taking shape and on its way. We'll have some new reporting from the Pentagon and what it means and how soon will we drop our objections to long-range missiles. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. Secretary Austin and General Milley are both in Europe today as the two leaders prepare to convene the 8th round of what's called the Ukraine Defense Contact Group. Nearly 50 nations are gathering in Germany tomorrow as Ukraine continues to ask for the West for more weapons, specifically tanks. The request comes as Berlin has stalled sending and approving the transfer of German-manufactured tanks to Ukraine. Officials in Germany are saying they will not greenlight the move until the U.S. agrees to send its own Abrams battle tanks to Ukraine. For what it's worth, German Chancellor Scholz is not crazy about the image of German tanks moving across Europe. This is why he's very sensitive to this, for what it's worth. Now, while the administration is preparing to announce another round of aid to Ukraine totaling well over $1 billion, the battle tanks and long-range missiles are not expected to be included. Well, we've seen this before. The administration says they will not provide specific weapons to Ukraine over concerns about escalation, only to announce the delivery of those systems months later. Do we have a similar situation here? Let's check in with our Pentagon correspondent, Courtney Kube. So, Courtney, what's in this tranche of weapons and the likelihood that today's no is tomorrow's is really a maybe and tomorrow's yes?
So there's another armored vehicle that is likely to be in this package tomorrow that's announced, and that's the Strykers. So this is it's a combat vehicle. It's armored. It's a people carrier, unlike a tank, which doesn't carry troops in it. But it's more about providing sort of a flexibility on the battlefield versus a tank, which is really something that's there for firepower. The Stryker will provide the Ukrainians with the ability to move around the battlefield faster and to move troops around. We're expecting that. There's some other things that could be included here. We should always expect to see large amounts of ammo, particularly artillery, in these packages, especially one that we're hearing from U.S. officials is going to be as large as this. It's going to be well over $1 billion. We could be talking multiple billions of dollars in this package. On the tanks, what has been under discussion now for weeks and months are the possibility of sending these older model Abrams tanks. The resistance is not even so much about the provocation. It's about the fact that they are, number one, really, really difficult to maintain. They take a long time to train on, and the Ukrainians actually have a lot of tanks already. So the Abrams tanks, that's going to be, at this point, we think that's going to be a no, at least for now. But you make the point that there have been a lot of other systems that have been the no until they become a yes.
And Courtney, I do always like to clarify, this is money Congress has already given to the Pentagon to spend. The Pentagon and the Biden White House decide when to allocate certain tranches of money and weapons, correct? That's what this is? This is not new.
Right. This is money that's been allocated. It's usually used under what's called the Presidential Drawdown Authority, and that is money. It's stockpiles, U.S. military stockpiles that are drawn down, and they take them and they send them over to Ukraine. There's another pocket of money or package of money, the U.S. Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, and that's a whole separate pile of billions of dollars. That's where industry is providing, manufacturing and providing other systems, not coming out of the U.S. military stockpiles. But yeah, this money has been allocated. The question is, it's billions of dollars, but they are going through billions of dollars of it every single month. Yeah, how long is this going to last?
And then replenishing, well, that'll be another congressional debate, and we all know how well congressional debates go. Courtney Kube over at the Pentagon Force. Courtney, as always, thank you for that reporting. Still to come, the abortion rights fight. It may be coming to a state legislature near you. In fact, it may already be there. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. Sunday marks the 50th anniversary of Roe v. Wade. At the time, it was a landmark Supreme Court decision on the right to an abortion. Of course, it's not really a landmark decision anymore because it doesn't exist. This anniversary looks a lot different than the other 49 because of the court's decision last year in Dobbs versus Jackson, essentially overturning Roe v. Wade. And it sent the question of abortion access back to the states. And the result? Get ready for a whole lot of state house fights this year, particularly the first 6 months. According to the Guttmacher Institute, more than a dozen states and Washington, D.C. have introduced legislation to expand abortion access, or another way to put it, protect reproductive rights already in place. And nearly double that amount are expected to take up bills that would further limit or ban abortion access. Some states are weighing bills on both sides of this issue. Minnesota's legislature is set to vote today on a bill that would enshrine the right to an abortion into state law. Last week, Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker signed a law that expanded abortion access and established protections for out-of-state residents seeking an abortion in the state of Illinois. And on the other side, Wisconsin State Senate quickly rejected Democratic Governor Tony Evers' push to put abortion rights to a ballot referendum. So what is this fight going to look like in the states? How are each party going to look by the end of this calendar year? I'm joined now by Reed Wilson. He's founder and editor of Pluribus News, basically the only decent news organization that focuses on state house reporting. So, Reed, I think you gave the numbers are moving. It's approximately 16 to 18 states trying to limit right now, and we've got about 8 to 10 trying to expand, depending on. But is there going to be a state? Every state legislature is convening this year. Is any of them not going to touch abortion?
No, of course not.
Right.
They're all, but the interesting thing about what we're seeing right now is that, for the longest time since Roe was the governing sort of law of the land, we saw Republican states trying to chip away little by little at what they could. They'd go from 22 weeks of viability to 20 to 18, all the way down, and sort of figure out what they could do around the law. Now the dog has caught the car, right? And so they get to explore things that we've never thought of before because they would have been clearly outside the realm of Roe. And I'll give you some examples. So in Wyoming, the legislature just introduced a bill that would end exceptions to abortion in cases of rape and incest. That's a conversation that was never happened in Roe world.
But now it's the Overton window has shifted on the right.
It has, and at the same time, that Wyoming bill is going to follow an Indiana bill that passed last year, sort of the first post-Dobbs restriction that allowed the state attorney general to sue an abortion provider in case the local district attorney decided not to. So you can imagine the liberal prosecutor in Indianapolis or Gary, Indiana, decides not to sue. Well, the state AG can step in there. This is a totally different set of arguments. And you mentioned Pritzker and some of the Democrats who are trying to protect women and providers who are getting these, who are providing these services coming in from out of state. Data privacy is suddenly a huge conversation around abortion in blue states. Washington State's working on something like that too.
Any counterintuitive things going out there, like any Republican legislatures expanding, say, birth control? You know what I mean? Like any of these attempts at being counterintuitive.
So it's forced, what I think is counterintuitive is this conversation has forced a debate within the Republican Party. For the longest time, Republicans have just been pro-life, that's it, end of list, let's move on to the next thing. Well, now you've got to define what that means. What about those exceptions for the life of the mother in some cases and rape and incest? At what point should we cut off abortion? There's a big debate going on in the South Carolina state legislature right now. Is it 6 weeks? Is it 15 weeks? Sort of the degrees of pro-life suddenly matter a lot because now without Roe, you can do whatever you want.
So let's talk about the political consequences here. I guess the first real test is the Virginia Assembly races in November. Is that how, where abortion is clear? I mean, we've already seen it in a special. Is that how you're going to be looking at this? How would you recommend political analysts to look at this?
Well, look, I think the first tests were in Kansas in the primary, in the August primary last year, Kentucky and a bunch of other states. But think of those two states, Kansas and Kentucky. Hard to get farther right there, right? But the pro-abortion rights side of those ballot initiatives actually won. I think Democrats credit a lot of what they did and how they performed in the midterm elections to the abortion debate being front and center. And now it's going to be front and center every single time because you've got these Republican legislators who are pushing one way and Democratic legislatures pushing the other.
The thing that I guess is fascinating to watch is guys like Glenn Youngkin and Ron DeSantis who in their own odd ways are trying to see if a middle ground exists.
That's
some abortion access. It seems like in these state legislative debates, there's just no room for middle ground, is there?
Well, I think there is.
If you even want to call it middle ground.
I think there is, and that's what's happening in states like South Carolina and Idaho and Montana. I mean, even in Idaho, we talked to the state Senate president there the other day, and he talked about the abortion absolutists, of whom he was not one. So there are cleavages among the Republican base here, the Republican legislatures, trying to decide just how far do you go. And that question, I think that's a fascinating question that really they've succeeded in their goal of ending Roe. Now you got to deal with it.
So I guess, is there a few states above others that you think the debates are are more mature and really worth following?
Yeah, the debates in the states where Democrats just took control of the legislature are going to be the most favorable for pro-abortion rights legislation. Minnesota and Michigan have both fast-tracked pretty much every abortion bill that they can. Maine is the same way. They're going to expand abortion rights access too. The interesting states, though, are the states that are doing different things, that are not just expanding rights or restricting rights, but allowing the AGs to go after abortion providers or protecting data privacy. I mean, these are new frontiers in a debate that's 50 years in the making.
How many states will be seen as essentially fully banned? Really quick. Will any of them go that far, you think?
Yeah, 4 or 5 will.
All right. We'll be watching. Reed Wilson, man, keeping track of legislatures. And I thought House races were
busy, man.
Good for you. Thank you all for being with us this hour. I'm going to be back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now. NBC News Now coverage continues with Hallie Jackson right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.